going to get started in a minute. Can you hear? Can you hear me back there? Is this live? What'd you do? Can you hear me back there? No. I'm not in charge of this. Testing. Oh, it works fine now. Thank you. Before we get started, while you're taking your seats, please put your phones on mute or turn them off out of respect to our guest speaker this evening. And thank you for doing that. A few times it happened during the high holidays and it was cute, but enough is enough. I would like to welcome a few guests tonight. Shulamit Bahat, who's from Beit HaTfutso. She is the CEO of the USA. Shulamit, you could stand up. She runs How many of you have been to Beit HaTfutso? Maybe 10 hands. The rest of you will learn a lot about it tonight. It's the Museum of the Jewish People on the University of Tel Aviv campus. And Ambassador Alfred Moses, our honored speaker this evening, he and his family have built the Hall of Synagogues. Those of you who've been to Beit HaTfutso and have seen the synagogue display, that's all courtesy of Ambassador Moses. He will be our guest speaker this evening and the former ambassador to Romania. But before we begin, we're going to have a little short video, and please watch it. I've seen it. It's under 5 minutes, and it's a moving video.
Was in New York?
In my pocket, I had nothing but $5 in my nana's old prayer book. But still I knew I will be all right.
How could you know that?
The first time in my life, I felt free to live and free to succeed.
Is that when you started the business?
No, it took a while. Back then, I knew about business like I knew about rocket science.
Where did you get the courage?
Faith.
Faith?
Yes, that's where courage comes from.
But what do you mean? How could you, practice the mitzvahs in secret? You whispered when reading the Torah?
Yes, whispered is a cellar. And the man sure the cellar door was locked.
Wow, Dushka. Everything's so different today.
For me, it's exactly the same.
What do you mean?
Remember what I told you when you went to Haiti after the devastation there?
Yeah, something in Yiddish or Hebrew, I forgot.
I told you that you were doing the most Jewish thing there is. Tikkun Olam.
Yeah, but after the earthquake, I just felt I had to be there. It had nothing to do with me being Jewish.
It has everything to do about being Jewish. I couldn't go on as if nothing happened, as if it was just another day at the firm.
But what about the death threats?
I was bloody scared. But to witness the injustice of apartheid and not take a stand, it was like living a lie. It reminded me of the stories my father told me of Lithuania.
But weren't you afraid to endanger yourself, your family, your social status?
Mother Muhammad.
הייתי מאוד מפורסמת. את יודעת שהייתי קצת יותר גדולה ממך כשהזמינו אותי להופיע מול המלך?
המלך.
הייתי בת 17 כשהופעתי על הבמה של התיאטרון הלאומי. אחרי 3 שנים, כל המדינה הכירה אותי.
אז למה עזבתי את זה? בשביל מה?
ህልማችን ለማሳካት ስንል ስንት ወር ነው በእግራችን የተጓዝነው ከዚች ሀገር ለመድረስ።
ומה גיליתם? שאנחנו שונים פה מכולם?
ይህ ገና እርግጠኛ ነኝ እንደሚቀያየር። ዛሬ እኔ አንቺን ይሄ ወታደር ልብስ ለብሰሽ ሳይሽ እርግጠኛ ነኝ አውቃለሁ ሀገራችን እዚህ ቦታ ቤታችን እንዳለ።
בשביל כל דבר צריך להילחם?
Il faut parfois lutter.
Il vous semble tout normal d'avoir votre bat mitzvah, mais moi,
Quand j'avais ton âge, je devais monter sur une chaise à la synagogue à Paris. Et j'ai crié tellement fort jusqu'à que tout le marais m'entende. Mon très cher rabbin.
Montre-moi dans la Torah où il est écrit qu'une fille
ne peut pas faire sa bat mitzvah. Alors, être juif signifie défendre ses croyances?
First of all, you have to listen to your heart.
Who says I'm not?
Look at me. Look at me for a minute, will ya?
¿Pero qué idioma es ese, abuelito? Ese no es español.
Es ladino, una lengua que hablamos en nuestra familia hace más de 500 años. Tú sabes que nuestra gente está dispersada por todos los rincones del mundo.
And wherever we went, we flourished and succeeded, but never forgot who we are. We are a people of many strands, which make up one unique ongoing story. And that's why, my darling, we need to keep writing it.
If you have never been, I
I'm in
encourage you.
Amsterdam, which is...
I'm competing with YouTube now. If you have never been, I encourage you to get to Eretz Yisrael and go see Beit HaTfutzot. It's a moving experience. It's the museum of our people, and it's well worth the effort. Format tonight's a little different. This is the 5th annual Am Yisrael Chai series. The ambassador has asked that instead of him speaking for 35, 40 minutes, that I interview him. And it will not be a 60 minutes type interview. I have some simple questions and we'll engage him in conversation. At the end, we'll open it up to the floor and you all can ask questions and he'll answer them. After the questions and answers, we have dessert in the back, social hall, and we have a book signing. One book per family unit. The ambassador has graciously agreed to sign the books for you. So please queue up and let him eat some dessert too. We didn't let him have much at dinner tonight. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ambassador Alfred Moses, former counsel to Jimmy Carter and ambassador to Romania under President Clinton. And we're going to sit over here. Oh, is that working? Yes. And one other thing, the books are free. I've donated the books, but if you have it in your heart to make a donation to Beit HaTfutzot, I would really appreciate it, and I know the ambassador would absolutely appreciate it. And the website is bh.org.il, but you know how to reach me through the directory, and I'll gladly do it again. So my first question for the ambassador is, how did you get involved with the Carter administration and why?
Good questions. First, let me say that I'm thrilled to be here this evening. My wife tells me that at my age, I should be thrilled to be anywhere. But I'm particularly pleased to be here at Kol Ami with Harvey, with David, with all of you, Wayne and Debbie, Ron, Cindy. Sorry, the rabbi's not here, but she has a shiva call tonight, I understand, in St. Petersburg. This is my first time in Tampa. I spoke here before. I was given a key to the city by the mayor. It was 40 years ago, and this is the first chance I've had to use that key. So it's nice to be with friends. It's nice to be able to talk a bit about our people, about my experiences in Romania, about my experiences in Washington, and anything else that may be on your minds. Harvey asked me about how did I end up with the Carter administration. And as I said, it's a good question. I did not know that he was going to ask me that question, so it may seem as though I'm stalling, but I'm not. I'm going to answer it. I got a call from the White House. The Carter administration was in trouble. Some of you may remember it was the spring of 1980. The administration had voted for a resolution that was contrary to the commitments that President Carter had given to Prime Minister Bacon concerning the status of Jerusalem. We were able later to reverse that. But I got a call asking if I would come over and advise the president on matters affecting the Jewish community and Middle East policy issues. I went over, not knowing very much. I'd met President Carter twice, once during the campaign, and I did head the effort on behalf of the Jewish community to combat the Arab boycott of Israel. The economic boycott, I led that mission. We got legislation passed through the Congress, 99-0 in the Senate, making it a criminal offense to engage in supporting the Arab boycott of Israel. It was a major decision, and I did show up on the lawn of the White House for that signing and met Carter on that occasion. But I can assure you, he did not know me and I did not know him. But I was brought in a few months later. Billygate erupted, if anybody remembers Billygate. Billy was the president's brother. He got in some difficulty with the Libyans, and I was then asked to be counsel to the president, and I was his counsel and worked very closely with him for the next 6 to 8 months. I can almost say daily. He was an open person. He confided in me his personal life, his family relationships, and all the things that were pertaining to the presidency and his problems as he saw them at the time. So the answer is I became the president's counsel purely because the president was in difficulty and the administration was looking for someone who had, in quotes, a leadership role in the Jewish community. You know what a leadership role in the Jewish community is. You're all leaders in the Jewish community. The Jewish community has nothing but leaders. I was just one among 5 million, but I guess my office was closer to the White House than yours. So I got the call and I went over and spent the next, whatever it was, 7 months working very hard to try to persuade the president to see the Jewish community for what it is, a wonderful contributing element in our society, to strengthen the relationship between our country and Israel, and to extricate the president from what were really silly charges pertaining to his brother. Incidentally, so that none of you asked me this question, I never met Billy Carter in my life. He always struck me as sort of a beer-drinking hayseed, but as I said, I never met him. The president was not a beer-drinking hayseed. If I've not answered your question, ask it again.
You answered the question
Take a shot at it.
If you'll notice something, the dear ambassador just recently celebrated his 90th birthday, and his memory is twice as good as mine. So when you ask questions and ask about these stories, he remembers them vividly. I have to look them up on my phone, but I turned the phone off tonight, so I can't look them up. What was life like in the White House then? Clearly different than today.
I can't tell you what it was like because I have nothing to compare it to. Meeting with the President of the United States is a truly moving experience. You sit in the Oval Office, you and the President, and he asks you questions and you fumble around a bit and try to answer them. I found him enormously intelligent, a bit insular. Here's a foreign boy who's been in the Navy from South Georgia. He didn't know much about the rest of the country, very little about Washington. His staff was predominantly people who had come through the campaign with him, which incidentally is a great mistake. If any of you were very close to the next president of the United States, please tell him or her, forget about the people who worked on your campaign. Try to find the best people in America and bring them in. But it's understandable. Presidents want to have people who are loyal to them, so they bring in the people that they've worked with who helped them become elected president. Are they the best qualified people? I didn't think so. I thought President Carter had 2 or 3 very strong people and a bunch of people who, frankly, if they were lawyers, I would not have hired them to work in our law firm. But that's true of most administrations. We read the papers every day. This administration has been beset with lots of problems: incompetence, disloyalty, difference of views, difference of temperaments. It's not a happy place. The Carter White House was starting to become unraveled when I got there in April of 1980. It had been a happy place when he was elected, but the trend lines were going against the administration. There had been inflation. There had been the gas shortage with the Iranians and the Saudis not shipping oil to the United States. It wasn't a happy time. And the president wasn't happy. And that the president's mood sort of permeates the White House. I also had a sense, and I've not shared this with anyone before, maybe my wife, I had a sense that there was some underlying anti-Semitism in the Carter White House. Not the president, we can talk about that, and certainly not Fritz Mondale, who was a great friend, but among his staffers from Georgia. I think they had some suspicions about this fellow who was overtly Jewish, was being brought in to work on issues, a particular concern to the Jewish community. So there was a little underlying current. Now, it may have simply been I was the new guy on the block. And as all of you know, when the new fellow comes in the office of the new woman, everyone looks around a bit and says, who's he? Who's she? It may have been some of that. I would say by the time I got to the Carter White House, it was a pretty somber place. Reagan was not yet the candidate of the Republican Party, but I think there was a sense that President Carter was in trouble. I think he had that view as well. So it wasn't all smiles and joy. There was competence, there was some honesty in decision-making, but there were also differences. I don't know how interested you are in American history, but there were 2 competing philosophies or geopolitical positions. One was a very tough stance on foreign policy issues, which was articulated probably most forcefully by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was National Security Advisor. And then there was an element that was more accommodationist, who was the position of the Secretary of State, Cy Vance, and I think of Fritz Mondale. The president pretty much kept his own counsel. So there were ideological, or at least foreign policy differences, and there was a certain somberness which grew out of the political environment in the United States as of the spring of 1980.
Well, thank you for that. Now, you were appointed by the Clinton administration to be the ambassador to Romania.
Yes.
How did it happen? What were the undercurrents? Were there any political backstabbing? What happened?
Well, that was purely an accident. When I was in the White House, I had a deputy who was lent to me by the State Department. His name was Mark Grossman. He was a young, rising Foreign Service officer who had just come from Pakistan. The Assistant Secretary of State, Hal Saunders, sent him over to help me on Middle East issues. Mark was a wonderful person. He was then all of 28, as I recall. I was older, I was 50. We worked very closely together. He saved my skin on a number of occasions. I knew nothing about foreign policy making, the procedures, and he was very adept at it and very adroit. Fast forward, it's no longer 1980, it's now 1993. We had lunch at a restaurant in Washington. He looked at me, his eyes half open, his head tilted to the side. I knew something was coming, but I didn't know what. He said, Al, how would you like to be ambassador to Romania? I said, wonderful, Mark, I'd love to be ambassador to Romania. How about being ambassador to Japan, China, Russia? I mean, it's not possible. I never gave a nickel to the Clinton campaign. I'm not a Foreign Service officer. He said, I know that, Al, but you know a lot about Romania. Now to answer your question. In 1976, the American Jewish Committee asked me to head a delegation. We were in Jerusalem. One group was going to Madrid. One group was going to Bonn, the capital of Germany, West Germany, Federal Republic of Germany at the time, and one group was going to Bucharest. And I drew the short straw and went to Bucharest. Shula's predecessor, a woman named Selma Hirsch, asked me to head that delegation, which I did. We got to Bucharest. That in itself is a story. We were going behind the Iron Curtain. I remember, can never forget, we flew from Athens to Bucharest at night. We got on a Tyrone plane at Tupolov. It was a little shaky. My wife looked up, saw chewing gum on the inside of the fuselage, and she concluded that the whole plane was held together by chewing gum. She said, "I'm getting off." Well, we didn't have a chance to get off. We landed in Bucharest. The next day, we visited the Jewish community. That's a story which I'm delighted to tell if anyone asks the question. After which, I went to the Athenai Palace Hotel, a storied hotel that was in terrible disrepair. And 3 young men came up to me and asked me if I was American. I said yes. They asked me if I was Jewish. I said yes. They said they were Jewish, and I had to help them because Jewish life in Romania was dreadful. They were being accused of whatever went wrong in Romanian society. It was the fault of the Jews. I had helped them get out. So that became my mission for the next 13 years. I met with Nicolae Ceausescu, the communist dictator, on several occasions, 3 to be exact. Got Jews out, which is a story in and of itself. Got the Baptist Bible printed in Romanian, which is a story in itself. And got 2 Christian clergymen out of jail, one of whom came to the United States later, Father Kaushu. So I was very active for 13 years in getting Jews out of Romania. It became my mission. After Ceausescu was shot on Christmas Day, 1989, I thought it was all over, but the chief rabbi, Moses Rosen in Bucharest, kept asking me to return to help the Jewish community. I did. So I remained very active on behalf of the Jewish community in Romania. Mark Grossman, go back to what I said earlier, my friend from my White House days, now Executive Secretary of the State Department, knew of my activity in Romania, and he persuaded the State Department to nominate or to recommend to the President that I be the American ambassador to Romania. I said to Mark, "That's fine, but I don't know anybody." He said, "Well, get to work." I called President Carter, he called President Clinton. I called my friend Wayne Kirkland, who was head of the AFL-CIO, Lane Kirkland, I'm sorry. Some senators I knew, Joe Lieberman and others. They went to work for me, some friends I knew in Arkansas. And lo and behold, I became the American ambassador to Romania. I was neither a foreign service officer nor a contributor to the president. So it was quite unusual in that respect. But as my friend Mark Grossman's wife said when we went through ambassador school together, "Al, the Romanians will never know what hit them." And I think that's right.
I think that's very true. I don't know what hit me either the last 2 days.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Excuse me?
I didn't hear you.
I said I don't know what hit me the last 2 days either. So I feel like the Romanians.
Yeah.
I don't know what hit me either. He heard it. He's just making fun.
No, I really didn't. But go ahead.
You mentioned in your book talking about finding older synagogues and older communities, the remnants of them, the remnants of the.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about Romanian Jewry. Anyone here have any relatives who come from Romania? Okay, well, you will know. Before World War II, Romania had 800,000 Jews. Second largest Jewish community in Eastern Europe, meaning west of the Soviet Union. Poland, 3 million, Romania, 800,000. 400,000 were killed in the war. 200,000 were killed by Eichmann at Auschwitz. 200,000 were killed by Romanians in Transnistria. 400,000 survived. That was more than survived Poland, you name it, any of the countries in Europe except the Soviet Union. 400,000. Before the war, 800,000, and there were shuls everywhere. In the largest city in eastern Romania, there were 70 shuls. None of them were shtibels, but they were functioning synagogues. By the time I got there in the 1980s, there were one synagogue. This is in Yash, in Wallachia. But there were still synagogues functioning or having the pretense of functioning throughout Romania. In the early 80s, this is long before I became ambassador, my two daughters and I went with the chief rabbi on his annual Hanukkah tour. We went to 38 synagogues in 8 days on a bus, traipsing across Romania. It was wonderful. The routine was always the same. We'd march into the synagogue, doesn't matter what time of day or night. First would be the chief rabbi with his mitered hat, his purple robe, a mug and David on a gold chain, and looking very rabbinical, and the people kissing his garments. It was as though the Mashiach had appeared. Then the choir would come in, 70 young people singing songs in Hebrew. There'd be speeches. The rabbi would speak. He'd call upon me to speak. I never knew the things I had accomplished before I heard the rabbi's introduction. He had me doing things that I never imagined anyone could do, let alone myself. But he was rather over the top in his introductions. It was a standard routine. We had two rabbis from Israel with us, the leader, the speaker of the Israeli Knesset, over on board. It was quite a show. 38 synagogues. I'll just mention the last of those. We got to Yash. I talked earlier about synagogues in Yash. There were 70 before the war, one by 1984. My daughters and I were there. We arrived at 9 o'clock at night. We were supposed to have been there at 6 or 7. Everybody was still seated. In came the chief rabbi. In came the choir. People standing and crying. The chief rabbi was exhausted. He was an old man. He was 68, about 22 years younger than I am now, but he was an old man. I was 51 or 2. Yeah, a little older, but he was still an old man. He turned to me and said, "Mr. Moses," I was always Mr. Moses, "you have to speak." What could I do? The chief rabbi of Romania, I'm in his country. Up I got, went to the microphone and said, "Dear congregants, the Jewish people had to wait 2,000 years from Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses of the Bible, to Moses Maimonides, the Rambam, the 12th century Spanish Jewish philosopher, wrote the Mishnah Torah. But tonight, you only have to wait another 3 seconds from this Moses, Alfred Moses, to Chief Rabbi Moses Rosen." And I sat down. And Moses Rosen looked at me with cross-eyed and shook his head and said, "Ah," and had to speak. That's what it was like. Let me just add that when the chief rabbi left the synagogue, the choir would sing, and he would march out very, very, very slowly. And the congregants cried. They wept. You don't know what it's like. The chief rabbi rebuilt the synagogues, to answer your question, in Romania. He got the money from the Joint, the Georgia Distribution Committee, and the steeples, synagogues, whatever they may be, were rebuilt, rededicated. They had very few congregants, but the synagogues were there. And he said to me, "I want the Romanian people to know that when we have no Jews left, there was once a flourishing Jewish community in Romania." It was all very dramatic, very moving. And here was this remnant almost of a former Jewish life, rich Jewish life in Romania, was carrying on as best he could to preserve Jewish life in Romania and to leave behind him what had been a flourishing Jewish community. There are lots of stories about this. The great synagogue, which Ceausescu was going to destroy, which we managed to save. That's another story. Many moving stories. There were only 2 functioning synagogues in Bucharest when I was ambassador. Every Shabbat I went to synagogue. To have the American ambassador leaning, reading from the Torah in a synagogue in Romania had an enormous impact. There had never been a Jewish ambassador from the United States to Romania. And here's a Jewish ambassador who not only is Jewish, but can lean and support synagogues and was an observant Jew. It was quite a change for Romania. To answer your question, Harvey, yes, Romania had a rich Jewish heritage. Pastrami, the word, and the meat comes from Romania. Yiddish theater began in Romania. But it's also a sad story, as was the story of all of Jewish life in Eastern Europe during and after World War II.
When you helped Jews get out of Romania, physically, how did it happen? Because it was a communist dictatorship.
Well, I got the Jews out. Very interesting story. Romania was desperate for foreign currency. The country was bankrupt. And what it needed to do was export. It needed to export to the Western world. And the United States market is by far the largest market in the Western world. Romania couldn't export to the United States unless it had most favored nation tariff status, MFN. We supported MFN in the Congress in return for a commitment from the Romanian government to let its Jews out and to observe human rights. We got the Jews out. Human rights is another story. We were able to improve conditions in Romania, but it was far from what it should have been. We were able to do it because of our activism on behalf of MFN in the Congress, working with the Carter administration, the Reagan administration, the Bush administration, Democrats, Republicans in the Senate. Senator Stevenson, Senator Danforth, one a Democrat, one a Republican, were particularly helpful. I remember one wonderful meeting we had with Jack Danforth. He was later our ambassador to the United Nations. Jack, among other things, was an Episcopal minister, a graduate of Yale Divinity School. He was about 6'4", enormous fellow, absolutely superb person of total principle. And I went in with Mark Tottlesman. I don't know if any of you knew Mark, but Mark was the Federation representative in Washington. Extremely effective lobbyist. Mark knew everybody in the Congress because he ran the program at Harvard for incoming legislators. So every member of the House, when they first were elected, every member of the Senate, when he or she was first elected, went to Harvard for a 2-week course on how to be an effective member of the Congress. That course was taught by Mark. Mark and I go in to see Jack. Jack isn't paying attention to me. He loves Mark. He says, "Mark, wonderful to see you, wonderful to see you." Mark's this tall, Senator's that tall. And he turns to Mark and says, "Mark, are you still working on behalf of Jews in Romania?" And Mark looks up and says, "Yes, Senator. And when I began, I was as tall as you are."
You've had a unique experience dealing with world leaders. Now let's separate not U.S. leaders, but the world leaders. Any particular people come to mind? Any anecdotes? Anything you'd like to share?
Well, there's my father and my grandmother. She was a world leader. At least we thought so. We thought she reigned. She didn't just rule. Yeah, I have met with most U.S. presidents from Harry Truman forward. When I was born, Herbert Hoover was president, but I was 3 when he lost the election. I never met him. I never met Roosevelt. I worked for Kennedy. I knew him quite well. President Johnson, yes. Never met with Nixon. President Ford, for sure. I thought he was wonderful. Carter, of course. Reagan, yes. Bush Sr. and Bush Jr. and Clinton, yeah. And Obama. I've never met with President Trump. They were all different. They had strengths and weaknesses, as we all do. In terms of world leaders, as I mentioned to you as we were driving over, the most impressive world leader that I've ever met and worked with and talked to was Anwar Sadat. Maybe it's because he had this deep baritone voice. I asked him questions, had lunch with him for 2 hours in his home, Mir Abu Kum. I asked him questions to get the answers I knew I would be hearing, such as whether he met with Ceausescu to persuade Ceausescu he met with Ceausescu at Ceausescu's invitation to persuade Sadat to meet with Begin. He told me about that story. He told me about his going to Jerusalem. He said he went to Saudi Arabia, asked the Saudis to go to Jerusalem with him. They said no. He'd already been turned down by Hafez Assad in Syria. And you have to have seen Anwar Sadat to get the majesty of the man. He said, as I was flying back from Saudi Arabia, I said to myself, Anwar, you go to Jerusalem. To hear that from Anwar Sadat was moving. He was a person of vision, of enormous courage. He did not foresee that he'd be assassinated, and he thought he was loved by the Egyptian people. It was an enormously courageous move on his part, and it changed the fate, I think, and the destiny and security of the state of Israel. For Egypt to be out of the Arab encirclement of Israel was an enormous breakthrough. Sadat said, and Carter said, both of them, that they felt that Prime Minister Begin should have solved the Palestinian problem at the same time, should not have just signed the Camp David Accords, which talked about the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people, but was never actualized. He thought it was an opportunity for Israel to have full peace. He had done his part with peace between Egypt and Israel, and he did try to persuade the Prime Minister to move forward with the Palestinian issues, as did President Carter. President Begin, for a host of reasons, didn't feel he could do that. He went about as far as he could go, be true to his own conscience, his party, and the Israeli electorate. Sadat saw that as a lost opportunity. Tell you another story, which is interesting. You maybe find this as interesting as I did. As you'll recall, Anwar Sadat was assassinated in 1981. I spoke to President Carter a week or two later. He had just returned from Cairo from the funeral. He said, Al, it was a very moving experience. I didn't realize how close the Sadat family felt to me, but as I was walking behind the casket to the burial, Anwar Sadat's son came up to me and said, President Carter, who was no longer president, I'm deeply moved, as is our family, that you came for my father's funeral. You are like a father to me. And President Carter was repeating this to me. He was obviously moved by the experience and the sentiment expressed. A week or two later, I'm in Jerusalem, and I'm meeting with Menachem Begin. And he says, Mr. Moses, with Begin, it's always Mr. Moses. He said, I went to Sadat's funeral. It was on a Sunday, maybe it was a Saturday, and I couldn't ride because the Israeli public would not expect me to ride on Shabbat. So I had to stay in an army barracks. It was filthy, filthy. Menachem Begin, filthy. Okay, Mr. Prime Minister. But I said, but there was a moving experience that afternoon. I was walking behind the cortege, and this young man came up to me and introduced himself. He said he was Anwar Sadat's son, and that he was so moved that I, the Prime Minister of Israel, came to his father's funeral, how honored he was, and how close he felt to me. He considered me as his father. I said to myself, how many fathers can a son have? He had Anwar Sadat, he had Jimmy Carter, he had Menachem Begin. So it was a triumvirate. Carter, Begin, Sadat. They brought about the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, which is, I believe, the most momentous event in the fate and history of Israel since Israel's independence in May 1949. It changed the whole geopolitics of the Middle East. And all three of them deserve credit for that. Carter was instrumental. Begin had the courage to agree to withdraw all Israeli forces from all of Egypt. And Sadat had the enormous courage to get on an airplane and fly to Jerusalem. I was there when Anwar Sadat arrived. I believe it was November 17, a Saturday night in Israel. It was like Mashiach had come. The streets were closed. He stayed at the King David Hotel. It was really, it was better than Simchat Torah. And I've been in Israel for Simchat Torah. It was celebration beyond anything you can imagine. Here was the president of Egypt coming to Israel. The next day he spoke with Knesset along with Prime Minister Begin and then Labor Party leader Shimon Peres, each of whom spoke magnificently. And all of the world was watching. Back to you.
I could go on all evening, but I'd like to open it up to the floor since it's already 20 to 9.
Yikes.
Well, because we're the only thing between them and dessert, Ambassador.
Okay, well.
So we have the roving mic. Does anyone have a question?
David, what are you doing?
It would be easier if it's roaming.
I don't need a roaming.
Easier if it's roaming?
I don't hear well without my
All
glasses.
right, I'll roam with the mic. Can I ask the first question?
Sure, you're the
As the
president.
holder of the microphone. I'm wondering what if you can maybe describe in some kind of detail what life was like for a Romanian Jew prior to 1989 in the early 1980s. What kind of trials and tribulations would a Romanian Jew be faced with?
Well, if you're a Romanian Jew, you want to get out. Life was very difficult for all Romanians. It was a communist regime. It was, if not the poorest country economically in Eastern Europe, it was so second to the bottom. Albania may have been the poorest. It was oppressive, and Jews got the worst of it all. The Jews have been thrown out of government. And if you're thrown out of government in a communist country, you're out of work. People who had responsible positions no longer did. Economists, physicians, scientists. The communist world went anti-Semitic in the early 50s with the Slansky trial and the doctor's plot, if you may remember. Stalin went berserk. Not entirely. From his standpoint, from the standpoint of the communist leaders in Eastern Europe, they had a losing ball club. Communism was going this way. It was never popular in Romania. And by 51, 52, it wasn't working. So the Romanians, the Hungarians, the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Latvians, the Czechs, all went native. They went to national communism. What they were espousing was not communism as much as their own country's history and sense of pride. And in Romania, if you're going to talk about Romanian history, Romanian pride, that leaves Jews out. Jews were a community apart. So communism in Romania and in the rest of Eastern Europe became quite anti-Semitic. Anna Pacher, who had been the foreign minister, was Jewish, was thrown out. Jews were thrown out of all positions of responsibility. So to answer your question, David, life for Jews in all of Eastern Europe in the late 70s, early 80s was dreadful. In Romania, it was particularly dreadful because the economic conditions were about as bad as they were anywhere in the communist world, and they weren't good anywhere.
Thank you.
Ambassador, I've enjoyed your presentation and discussion very much.
Thanks, Ron.
I would like to ask if you could tell us how and when President Carter developed his current attitudes toward the State of Israel.
Well, that's a tough question. I knew Jimmy quite well because I was his lawyer. He told me I saved the nomination for him. And maybe I did. President Carter is not anti-Semitic, and he's not anti-Israel. No question in my mind. There's no newspapers here, are there?
No.
Okay, this is very much off the record. There's no question in my mind that he felt closer to Sadat than he did to Begin. I might have too. Begin was a very complicated fellow. Tough to get him to make decisions, to declare what he really needed. A lot of back and forth, a little bit of, we say in Yiddish, handling. Sadat was very different. He was British trained. He said from the outset what it was he needed. The Israelis to withdraw from all of Egypt, and he needed some cover on the Palestinian issue. So Carter felt more comfortable, I think, with Sadat than he did with Begin. then Sadat never understood the Jewish story. Pardon me, Carter didn't. He's a Baptist from South Georgia. Intellectually, he knew the Bible. He had no anti-Jewish feelings, but he wasn't comfortable with the Jewish story. I may have mentioned earlier at dinner tonight with our friends. At one point, I congratulated him after he spoke at the NAACP convention. This is September 1980. And he said, Al, I'm very comfortable with African-American audiences. Let Fritz, meaning Mondale, speak to the Jewish audiences, labor audiences. I'm not really comfortable there. I'm comfortable with African-American audiences. I said to myself, I know why. The culture is the same. The African-American culture that he's felt comfortable with is a Southern culture. It's high man, you got it. That was Jimmy Carter's culture. He felt comfortable there. He thought he knew the black community. He didn't really know the Jewish community. There were a lot of Jews working in the White House. Saul Linowitz, myself, Lloyd Cutler, Stu Eisenstadt. I don't think he thought of us, other than I, as being Jewish, number one. But he never fully understood the message of the Holocaust, its impact upon world Jewry, the importance to world Jewry and to Jews in Israel of the security of the state of Israel. And over time, I think he's increasingly seen the Israelis as having the upper hand militarily, and they do, thank goodness, and the Arabs being the underdogs. And Jimmy Carter is a guy who identifies with the underdog. It's just in his bones. Maybe his Christian heritage, I don't know. But he's gone much further in that direction since he got away from me.
You were a good influence.
I don't know if there's any influence, but I tried. He and I went and spoke. We spoke at the at the B'nai B'rith meeting. I wrote his speech for him. We spoke at the Hanukkah commemoration for Israeli bonds. And after he was president, he came back from Georgia to speak at the Rabbinical Conference in New York. I wrote a speech for him then. He was open and intellectually. You would say he was even-handed. Emotionally, he was for the underdog. And also, he feels, I think, that he was not appreciated by the Jewish community. That his contribution to peace in the Middle East and security of the state of Israel, for his role in bringing about the Camp David Accords and the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, was never appreciated in the Jewish community. So I think there's a little bit of a feeling that love was lost that shouldn't have been. That's my sense. That doesn't mean it's accurate, but you asked the question, so I'll give you my answer. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a question regarding Israel's relations with Yugoslavia at that time. Did the relations between Israel and Romania at that time, did they have any, it was pretty good with Ceausescu at that time. Did they have any influence in the Jewish life to the Jews at that time?
Who's talking about the Israeli relationship with Romania, correct?
Yes, with Romania, with Ceausescu.
With Ceausescu.
It was a time that they had good relations.
Well, I'll tell you, all right. Ceausescu and the Israelis were both playing a great double game. Ceausescu did not break relations with Israel during the Six-Day War. All the other communist countries did. Romania did not. Ceausescu was playing this sort of wily game that, yes, he was a communist, but he wasn't a Soviet dupe. When the Soviet troops went into Prague in August of 1968, he put tanks on the runways of the airports in Romania so Soviet transport planes could not land. he maintained an independent view on foreign policy issues. He regularly visited with Tito in Yugoslavia, who had broken with Stalin. He regularly went to China, where they treated him as a demigod. He thumbed his nose at the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union hated Ceausescu. The Israelis were playing the game with him. As I mentioned earlier, Ceausescu played this in-between role, encouraging Begin to meet with Sadat, encouraging Sadat to meet with Begin. But the Israelis had their own game with regard to Romanian Jewry. I'll give you two stories. In 1981, I got a call from Moses Rosen, the chief rabbi of Bucharest. Mr. Moses, you've got to help us. The Israeli ambassador to Romania just told me that the great synagogue is going to be destroyed. That he'd met with the mayor of Bucharest. Ceausescu was clearing 2 square miles of land in downtown Bucharest to build this monument to socialism. That the Israeli ambassador visited with the mayor. The mayor promised him the Sephardic synagogue built by Jews who had left the Iberian Peninsula after the Inquisition, would be preserved, and the Great Synagogue. And after he left the mayor's office feeling reassured, he went around the corner, walked by the Sephardic synagogue, looked over, and it was destroyed. So in his mind, this is the Israeli ambassador, the Great Synagogue would be destroyed next. The chief rabbi called me, Mr. Moses, you've got to help us save the Great Synagogue. I went to the State Department, got up to the level of George Shultz, the Secretary of State. He met with the Romanian Foreign Minister on the fringes of the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly in New York, told Foreign Minister Tofu that if the Great Synagogue was destroyed, the United States would re-examine its relations with Romania. Pretty tough stuff. The Great Synagogue was saved. In the middle of all this, I got a call from the Israeli embassy in Washington. It was Eli Rubinstein on the phone. Anybody know Eli? He was the DCM then. He was later Vice President of the Supreme Court of Israel. Wonderful person, wonderful friend. Eli called me. He was then acting ambassador. The ambassador was in the hospital. Meir Rosen. And he said, Mr. Moses, he never called me Mr. Moses, but this is Mr. Moses. I have a message to read to you from my government. I said, okay, Eli, let's have it. The message was something like this. Dear Mr. Moses, we know you're very active in trying to save the Great Synagogue in Romania. Please understand, the government of Israel has a special relationship with the government of Romania. And please don't do anything that will put that relationship under further strain. Please be careful in your efforts because of our special relationship with Romania. Well, I couldn't believe it. Here was a Jewish state telling me to ease off on trying to save the Great Synagogue. I said, Eli, is there any other word from your government? He said, well, that's the message. I said, well, here's my message to your government. I'm going to do everything I can to save the Great Synagogue, whether your government likes it or not. Eli said, I deliver the message of my government. I'll now give you my personal message. I agree with you. And he hung up the phone. So the Israeli relationship with Romania was complicated. And the Israelis were doing things under the table, around the bend, you name it. There are other stories, but dessert is waiting. Very complicated. You have to be hardened to the ways of foreign policy maneuver to appreciate, or put it more gutturally, to stomach all the things that were going on. The world isn't on all occasions a very nice place, and that relationship was
We'll take
two more
questions, and then
one more, sure.
Two more.
Two
more. Right.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here tonight. A couple of questions kind of related. How did President Carter deal with the change in Iranian leadership and sentiment going against the Western civilization and specifically against the Shah? And then what was the atmosphere in the White House after the hostages, U.S. hostages, were taken up till the end of his term?
What's the question?
He was talking about the relationship with the Shah
Oh,
Jimmy Carter?
well, I was not in the White House. I came in right after the seizure of the American embassy. And I don't think I ever discussed the Shah with President Carter. As you may recall, it was not a great moment in U.S. foreign policy. Carter had gone to Tehran in December of '77 and extolled the Shah. The Shah was then deposed by Khomeini. The American embassy was seized after we gave the Shah the right to enter the United States for medical treatment in New York, which was the right thing to do. He then left, as I recall, for Mexico. But there's no question in my mind that Jimmy Carter became a hostage in that embassy. He was preoccupied with getting the American hostages released. And the Iranians were playing with him right up to the election, sort of dangling a yes or a maybe and then a no. He pawned his presidency to the Iranians, and boy, they sucked it dry. So whatever Carter may say, I will tell you that they played him for a fool, and he allowed them to. He should have simply said, you release the hostages, and until you do, don't call me. And add a little bit to that, more than simply sanctions. He did, as you know, try to rescue the hostages, but it was a cowboy exercise, in my view, landing the 3 helicopters, 2 of which got damaged badly by sandstorms. It was an amateurish undertaking, unlike the undertaking against Osama bin Laden and against Baghdadi this week. Carter became a hostage in the embassy. His relationship with the Shah, I have no idea.
We'll take one final question, if there is one, unless you're hungry. They're hungry.
Nosh made
tired.
great desserts, so.
So I just want to personally thank the ambassador. I hope you had a wonderful evening.
And a very special thank you to Harvey Mackler for continuing to sponsor the 5th annual Am Yisrael Chai lecture. Thank you, Harvey. You continue to bring us great people.
Thank you all for coming.
Dessert is served in the social hall.
Because I was writing at the time. You know what his favorite tennis partner was? Who? Billy Nastasi.